Let me tell you about the kind of morning that changes how you look at things. It was a Saturday in late September, the kind that comes to the Laurentians with cold air and wood smoke, and a sky so blue it almost hurts to look at it. Cecile Moreau had driven 40 minutes from St. Lin to get to the estate sale in time, and she almost didn't. Her truck had given her trouble at the end of the gravel lane, the way it always did in cold weather, and she'd sat there for a minute with her hands on the wheel, thinking about turning back. She didn't turn back. That's the part worth remembering. The sale was held at a property on Alban Desrosiers, a farmhouse that had belonged to a man named Alban Desrosiers. He'd passed in July at 83, a widower, no children that anyone locally knew of. A distant nephew from Drummondville had driven up to manage the estate, and from what the neighbors said, he hadn't stayed long enough to understand what he was selling. The nephew had hired a company to price and tag everything. That company sent two young men in matching gray shirts who walked through Alban's workshop with clipboards and assigned numbers to things the way you'd price items at a church rummage sale. A box of jars, $5. A set of sawhorses, $20. The seed cabinet along the north wall, 6 drawers, hand-labeled in pencil. 40 years of careful notation, $12. Cecile found out about the sale the way she found out about most things. A handwritten notice on the corkboard at the co-op in St. Lin, under a flyer for a lost dog, and above one for a church supper. She'd read the address, recognized the name Desrosiers, and felt something she couldn't quite name. She'd never met Alban, but she'd heard of him. You have to understand something about Cecile Moreau before this story makes the kind of sense it should. She was 54 years old. She'd grown up on a farm outside Saint-Julien, the youngest of 4, the only one who'd stayed in agriculture. She had a small operation, 40 acres, market vegetables, some heritage grain she'd been coaxing along for the past decade. She wasn't wealthy. She wasn't well known. But she had spent 30 years paying close attention to seeds, to soil, to the kind of knowledge that lives in the hands and the memory of people who are disappearing. She'd heard Alban Desrosiers' name once at an agricultural heritage conference in Quebec City maybe 8 years before. A presenter had mentioned him almost in passing, a grain farmer in the Laurentians who had maintained a living seed collection for decades, selecting and saving varieties that hadn't been sold commercially since the 1950s. The presenter had used the word irreplaceable and then moved on to the next slide. Cecile had written the name down. She arrived at Rang des Érables at 8:30, which was half an hour before the sale officially opened, because she'd learned over the years that the best things go to people who show up before the signs say to. There were already 6 or 7 others in the driveway. She recognized one, a picker from Joliet who specialized in furniture, and nodded at him. He nodded back. They were not friends, exactly, but they understood each other. The nephew, whose name was Gaëtan, let people in at 9 o'clock sharp with the slightly harried look of a man who wants to be done with something. He was pleasant enough. He explained that everything was tagged, cash, or e-transfer, no holds, no negotiations. He said this in the tone of someone reciting a policy he'd been told to recite. Cecile walked through the farmhouse quickly, the way she always did, one pass to see everything before going back for anything. The furniture was unremarkable. The kitchen things were old and clean. In the front room, there was a wooden cabinet full of paperback novels and Reader's Digest and condensed books, and on the mantel a framed photograph of a man standing in a field with his shading his eyes, squinting into the sun. She paused at that photograph for a moment. He looked like a man who knew what he was looking at. She found the workshop through a door off the back hallway, and she stopped in the doorway the way you stop when something requires you to. The room was 15 feet by 20, maybe, with a workbench along one wall and shelving along the other two. On the shelving, hundreds of small envelopes and glass jars, each one labeled in pencil in a handwriting that was cramped and precise. Some labels had dates, some had locations, some had notes in a shorthand she didn't immediately understand, abbreviations and symbols that had their own internal logic. Along the back wall, a pegboard held tools, and on the workbench, laid out flat, were 3 handmade wooden trays, each compartmented, each holding envelopes in rows. The tag on the shelving unit said $45 for the lot. She stood there for a long moment. And then she did what she always did when she needed to think. She looked at the thing more carefully. She picked up one of the jars. The label read, Avon de la Baie, 1987, 3 generation, germination 94%. Oat variety, 3rd generation selected. Germination rate noted. She put it down and picked up another. Seigle d'automne, Rang Boschman, 1991, Résistant à l'averse, a rye, named for a road, noted for standability in wind. She opened one of the envelopes from the wooden tray. Inside, in a small paper fold, were perhaps 40 seeds. The envelope was labeled in the same hand, and at the bottom, in slightly smaller writing, a note. Donner à quelqu'un qui comprend. Give to someone who understands. Cecile set the envelope down very carefully. She looked at the shelving again. All of it, slowly left to right. She counted the jars she could see, over 100. She looked at the envelopes in the trays. There were at least 200. She looked at the labels, the dates, the notes, the years of effort recorded in pencil on paper, a man she had never met who had spent his life doing what she had spent her life doing. She was aware that she was the only person in the room. 2 other people had looked in, glanced around, and left. Nothing in here looked like money to them. Nothing had a finish or a brand name or the kind of obvious age that signals value to a general buyer. She thought about what she was looking at. She thought about what it would mean if she didn't buy it. There's a question here that I want you to sit with for a moment before I tell you what she did. It's not a complicated question, but it's not a simple one either. If you are the only person in a room who understands the value of what's in that room, and the price on the tag is $45, and you have $45 in your pocket, what do you owe? To whom? And what does it mean to pay a fair price for something when fairness depends entirely on knowledge that only you have? Cecile walked out of the workshop and found Gaëtan in the kitchen, talking to the man from Joliet about a pine dresser. She waited until there was a pause, and then she said, "The shelving unit in the workshop, the jars and envelopes, is that included in the $45 price, or just the shelves?" Gaëtan looked at her with the mild confusion of someone being asked a question about something he hadn't thought about. "The whole thing," he said. "Whatever's in it. The seed collection, too." He looked at her more carefully now. "Is it worth something?" She said what she said next without hesitating, and I want you to notice that because it cost her something. "I think it might be," she said. "I'm an agronomist. Some of these varieties are old. I'm not certain of the value, but I think you should know before I offer you anything." Gaëtan blinked. He looked at the floor for a moment. Then he said, "What do you think it's worth?" "I don't know exactly," she said. "More than $45. If you want, I can take contact information for your cousin, the heir, and write them a letter with my assessment after I've had time to go through it properly. Or I can offer you what I think is fair right now, and you can decide." He looked at her for a long time. What would fair be right now? She thought about it. She thought about what she knew and what she didn't. She thought about a man named Alban Desrosiers, standing in a field with his hand shading his eyes. She said, $300. "And I'll send a written inventory to the estate within 60 days with my professional assessment." Gaetan said he'd have to think about it. He went and made a phone call, standing in the hallway with his back to the room, speaking quietly. It took about 4 minutes. When he came back, he said yes. Cecile wrote the check at the kitchen table on a Saturday morning in the Laurentians, with the smell of old wood and the quiet sounds of strangers moving through someone's life. She tore the check along the perforated edge carefully. She handed it to Gaetan. He thanked her and put it in his shirt pocket without looking at it. She drove home with the seeds in the back of her truck, in cardboard boxes she'd brought for the purpose, each tray and jar wrapped in the old flannel shirts she kept behind the seat. She drove carefully. She didn't put the radio on. It took her 3 weeks to go through everything properly. She worked at the kitchen table in the evenings, with a good lamp and her own seed records for reference, cross-checking labels against variety databases, germination logs, historical agricultural catalogs from the provincial archives she accessed online. She kept a notebook. What she found was this: Alban Desrosiers had spent approximately 40 years maintaining a living seed library of heritage grain and legume varieties specific to the Laurentian growing region. Many were varieties that had not been commercially available since the mid-20th century. Some had been bred by Alban himself, selections made over decades, adapted to his particular soil and climate, recorded with a precision that any plant breeder would recognize as rigorous. 3 of the rye varieties showed characteristics she hadn't seen documented anywhere else. One oat, the Avoine de la Baie, appeared in a 1948 provincial agricultural report as a variety then considered locally significant, and had apparently been kept alive in Alban's collection ever since. She found at the back of the bottom drawer of the seed cabinet a binder. It was an ordinary 3-ring binder, the kind sold at any pharmacy, with a cover that said simply notes in black marker. Inside were 142 pages of handwritten documentation, germination rates by year, planting dates, yield observations, disease resistance, notes on flavor, notes on which neighbors had received which varieties and in what years. There was a section in the back labeled Correspondence that contained photocopies of letters from 2 plant geneticists, one from the Université Laval and one from Agriculture Canada, who had apparently visited Alban in the 1990s and written to him afterward. Their letters were technical and enthusiastic. His copies of his replies were not included, but the margins of their letters were annotated in his pencil, with responses and corrections, and, in one case, a firmly circled disagreement. She sat with that binder for a long time. On the last page, in handwriting slightly larger than the rest, Alban had written, "Pour celui ou celle qui finira le travail," for whoever finishes the work. Cecile wrote her letter to the estate. She wrote it carefully, the way she wrote everything, and she sent it by email to the address Gaetan had given her, with a PDF attached. The PDF was 22 pages. It detailed every variety she had identified, its provenance, as best she could establish, its approximate value as genetic material, and her assessment of the collection's significance to regional agricultural heritage. She had consulted, before writing it, with a colleague at the Institut de Technologie Agroalimentaire who had confirmed her assessment of the 3 unusual rye varieties. She also wrote, in the covering email, that she was prepared to offer the estate an additional payment if they felt the original price had not been adequate, and that she would leave that to their discretion. Gaetan's response came 3 days later. He said he'd forwarded the letter to his cousin, who was the actual heir, and that his cousin had called him, somewhat stunned, and asked who this woman was. Gaetan said he'd told her, just someone who showed up at the sale and knew what she was looking at. The cousin, her name was Veronique, and she lived in Ottawa, wrote to Cecile separately. The email took a while, When it came, it was long. She said that she hadn't known her great-uncle well, that she'd visited the farm as a child and found it dull. The way children find dull things they don't yet have the equipment to understand. That she'd managed the estate at a distance and had assumed there was nothing of value because no one who came through the house had told her otherwise. That she'd cried when she read Cecile's assessment, not because of the money, though yes, she said, she'd had to sit down for a moment when she understood the implications, but because of the binder, because of pour celui ou celle qui finira le travail. She said she hadn't known he'd written that. She'd said she wished she'd gone to visit him more. Cecile read this email at her kitchen table on a Tuesday evening in late October with a cup of tea she'd forgotten to drink. The tea had gone cold. Outside, the field was bare and brown and getting ready for snow. She looked out at it for a while. She thought about Alban Desrosiers standing in his workshop, labeling his jars, writing his notes, keeping his collection alive through 40 growing seasons, hoping, not with urgency, because he was not an urgent man, you can tell that from his handwriting, but hoping in the quiet and patient way of someone who does a thing that matters and trusts that mattering will be enough. She thought about what it means to know something deeply and have no one around you who knows it too. She thought about the two geneticists who'd visited in the 1990s and then gone back to their universities, and the letters he'd filed away, and the annotations in the margins. She wrote back to Veronique. She said that she intended to propagate the collection over the next several growing seasons and to donate a portion of each variety to a regional seed library she was affiliated with in Lanaudière. She said she would like, if Veronique was willing, to name 3 of the undocumented varieties after Alban. The naming conventions for heritage varieties allowed this, and she would handle the registration. She said she thought he deserved that. Veronique said, "Yes, please, and thank you." And she cried again, she admitted, which Cecile believed. There is a thing that happens sometimes in the lives of people who work quietly at things no one is watching, where the work outlasts the working, where the knowledge survives the knower, where the jars in the back of the workshop are still there on a Saturday morning in September, still labeled, still viable, waiting. Alban Desrosiers had spent 40 years preparing for a morning he would not live to see, and I don't think he was doing it out of hope, exactly. I think he was doing it out of faith, not religious faith, but the kind that comes from understanding, deeply, that the work is worth doing whether or not anyone is watching. And the thing about that kind of faith is that it is almost always right. The 3 rye varieties that Cecile identified, the ones without a name in any catalog she could find, were registered the following spring through the Seeds of Diversity Canada Heritage Variety Program. The first is listed as Seigle des Rosés Laurentians, selected for cold tolerance and noted for its unusual reddish hull. The second is listed as Seigle Rang des Ables, adapted to the specific drainage conditions of the area. The third, the one about which the geneticist had written most enthusiastically, the one that Alban had disagreed with in the margin, is listed simply as Seigle Alban. It grows, if you are curious, quite well. And the Avoine de l'Abeille, the one that appeared in the 1948 provincial report, the one that had been kept alive through 40 years of careful saving, is currently in the ground on Cecile Moreau's farm in St. Lin, in a trial plot of 1/10 of an acre, surrounded by the ordinary commercial oats she grows for market. It does not look dramatic. It is taller than the commercial varieties, and the heads are a little longer, and it matures perhaps 4 days later. In late August, when the light in the Laurentians has that particular quality it gets before the angle starts to change, the Avoine de l'Abeille catches the evening sun differently than the oats beside it. Cecile notices it most evenings when she walks the field. She doesn't say anything. She just looks at it for a moment. Then she walks on. Some knowledge travels quietly. Some work is done in rooms no one enters. And some Saturday mornings, the person who shows up and pays attention is exactly who the work was waiting for, even if neither of them knew it yet. I think about Cecile standing in that workshop doorway a lot. Not the dramatic version of it, not the movie moment where the light hits just right and the music swells. Just a woman in her 50s, alone in a cold room, holding a glass jar up to the window and reading a penciled label. That's the whole picture. And somehow, that's the part that stays with me. What she did that morning required 3 things, and I don't think you can separate them. The first was knowing. 30 years of paying attention, of staying when others left, of caring about something unfashionable and unglamorous. That's what put her in a position to recognize what Alban had built. Knowledge isn't luck. It accumulates slowly, in the background, in the years when nobody's watching, and there's no obvious reward for it. Cecile had that knowledge because she'd chosen, over and over, to keep learning. That kind of understanding doesn't arrive. You build it, one season at a time. The second thing was honesty. She could have paid the $45 and said nothing. That was the legal transaction, and nobody would have questioned it. The estate had set the price. She had the money. Done. But she walked out of that workshop and told Gaetan she thought it might be worth more before she made any offer at all. That moment cost her something real. It risked the whole purchase, could have complicated everything. She did it anyway, because she understood that being the only person in the room who knows something doesn't give you the right to use that knowledge against the people who don't. Integrity, I've come to believe, isn't about the situations where doing the right thing is easy. It's about that specific moment when you could reasonably get away with the other thing and you don't. The third thing was the follow-through. The letter, the 22 pages, the 60 days of evening work at the kitchen table, the registration of 3 varieties she could have simply kept and used herself. A lot of people are honest in the moment and then let it drift. Cecile didn't let it drift. She made the promise, and then she kept it, in writing, with her name on it, sent to strangers who had no way to compel her. That's a different kind of strength than the dramatic kind. It's quieter, and I think harder. The cause and the effect here seem obvious in hindsight the way they always do. She showed up. She paid attention. She told the truth. She did the work. And because of that, 3 rye varieties that might have composted in a barn are now registered, growing, named. Alban's 40 years of careful labor didn't disappear into an estate sale on a Saturday morning. It found exactly who it needed to find. I'm not sure Cecile would say she did anything remarkable. I think she'd say she just did what the situation asked for. But that's the thing about people who actually have good judgment and steady character. They tend not to notice how rare those qualities are, because to them it just feels like the obvious next step. The seeds are in the ground now. They'll come up in the spring. And somewhere in a file folder in Ottawa, Veronique has a 22-page letter that tells her who her great-uncle really was. That seems like enough.